It felt appropriate to read and review Amazon Original's latest horror anthology, the Shivers collection, in time for this year's scary season. In the past, I have read and reviewed their Darker Corners collection with very mixed results you could check out over here, but that was a much older entry, so what do I think of these newer, more experienced releases? As always, we're going to review the stories themselves, we're going to talk about their position in the collection, and whether or not they fit the collection's tagline. In this case, Feel the Fear, which honestly is an incredibly open-ended prompt. I feel like almost any horror story could fit it. But I guess we'll see how the books do in execution, which will make this a little bit more subjective than normal, since it'll be about what gives me fear or horror. But I'll do my best to answer that question both for myself and just like generally what the story is attempting if it would be scary for some people. Jackknife by Joe Hill. This is the best opening story I've had in a while. Maybe ever. To be fair, I have been taught not to expect a lot from the first book in any of these installments. And I really didn't expect that much from Joe Hill in specific, even though I've heard a lot of great things about him from like in-life real people who have read his books. I just sort of figured like he wasn't for me, or he was doing something very similar to his dad, Stephen King, and I only have like middling reviews for most of Stephen King's works. And on top of that, I get a ton of horror recommendations from like more interesting authors with more interesting premises, so I had just sort of put Joe Hill entirely to the side, probably never to return to. And after reading this one, I'm regretting that choice a little bit, and I think I really am going to want to seek him out more in the future. And in my July reading wrap-up, I do give a review that's more or less trying to sum up its perfection. The story starts intriguing, the middle is intriguing, and the end was brutal and intense and everything you want in a horror novella. But something I don't touch on there is how funny and absurd the whole thing is, because talking about that would have been sort of a major spoiler. But our protagonist is facing off against a killer tree. And no matter how much atmosphere, horror, tension you put in that, when you say that's what we're fighting, it's funny. And if we actually talk about the backstory of how we got this killer tree, it's kind of even more amusing, because it's a sycamore tree that presumably was normal, was used to get vigilante justice where the town hung a supposedly perverted choir instructor who was after a much younger girl. And after that hanging, the tree gained sentience, the ability to move around, and is slowly killing the mob of people who sought street justice, which all culminated in a group of Boy Scouts going after this sycamore tree and somehow maiming it enough to like pin it in place and stop the killing spree where it was at. Don't get me wrong, Hill does a great job describing it, making it feel believable and scary, but it's funny, and it's hard not to see the humor in this kind of like absurdist premise. Further highlight Hill's talent, because he takes a silly concept and makes it scary and tense and engaging. And he allowed me to both see the whimsy and sort of the humor in the situation and the setup, but also feel invested and scared. And beyond the horror itself, there's like some nice thematic resonance between the dude who's like possessing the sycamore, who was kind of a perv on a younger student, and our main protagonist, who is an ex-college professor about to be fired because of his relationship with a student. A thing this professor is in heavy denial about, because he keeps saying that she started it and that it never really went anywhere because it was only texts. And it made me wonder about his ability to free the tree. Like, is this a situation where one perv is helping another perv out? And if that's the case, is the tree gonna seek justice on him and try to kill him, or is the tree like gonna protect him and take out all of his ops? Like, there was a lot of uncertainty and tension about the tree and his relationship to this college guy, whether or not he was in danger or not. And honestly, whether or not I cared if he was in danger or not, because even though he's not doing anything illegal by having an inappropriate relationship with the student, certainly it does show a lack of moral quality of character, heavily leaning into with his denial, his continual abuse of alcohol, his periodic blackouts, and some of the things he says in like his drunken stupor that sort of indicates he's gonna go like a step further and into some form of like illegal activity, harm against this woman or possibly his wife. All of which made me feel like not so bad if he gets killed by this tree, but at the same time being kind of worried for like the area surrounding the tree if he does die, because then no one knows what's going on and we just have like a killer tree taking random innocent people out, and that feels like very unjust to the community for the wrong wrongdoings of this one dude. And also, given we only experience the tree's sentience, movement, and malicious intent through a limited third-person perspective of a professor who's an unreliable narrator because he's a drunk, he's blacking out, he's doing things he doesn't remember and saying things that make him seem deranged. It made me wonder if the tree itself is a hallucination or a manifestation of guilt, and if he's just doing these killings and all this awful stuff, and we're gonna find out that he's sort of like gone to the next stage of maniac at the end of the story. And we get an answer to a lot of this in the final standoff between him and the tree at his cabin house, which again is both really scary and funny. The idea there's a sycamore tree just like waiting for him up against the glass window in the bathroom, and when he sees him, the tree tries to take him out through the house. And the tree does it while he's like peeing, which is always a funny kill. And then even more funny than that, the tree like fails in killing him and splits himself in two, which I think means the tree is dead and no longer able to hurt anyone, but has also like successfully pinned down this dude and leaves him with a brutal and like crushing decision to make about whether or not he can remove his own leg and tourniquet enough and stay conscious long enough to actually reach out and get help, or whether or not he's gonna slowly die here under this sycamore tree. Which gives like this larger than life, kind of funny, supernatural terror a very grisly, gritty ending that kind of is shocking and leaves you feeling like really gut punched at the end. Because even though there have been some gruesome descriptions up until this point, it's been about dead people, not about like self-mutilation you might have to do to survive an otherwise certain death. What more can I say? I think this was a perfect story. It had a little bit of everything you want in a horror. And as far as an introduction to the collection, I think this really sets the bar very high going forward. And in that way, I think it's a great intro to the Shivers collection. It really gives you like a broad spectrum of the kind of fear you're going to feel, the different ways authors can engage with you, and gets to be like a fun, flashy entry to start with. The Indigo Room by Stephen Graham Jones. This author and I have like a hot and cold relationship. I either really love his work or am not into it at all. And the Indigo Room sort of covers that wide spectrum of Stephen Graham Jones emotions for me, because I started with the highest of highs, really being interested in the tone and the style of the writing, finding like the hook that she sees something gruesome in the Indigo Room, and now we're waiting to see it like actually manifest in real life to be really like an engaging, promising sort of start. And I love how we dive into like sort of an intimate look at her life, where she was married to this guy and had a huge health scare on him because he's got a heart condition, and this health scare sort of contributed to the breakdown of their marriage, and also that this health scare and heart condition might have hereditarily passed down to his son and might be endangering her child retroactively, like a ticking time bomb, giving us like a whole ton of different like parent existential dread kind of fear just to jump with. And it's sort of like pairing the Indigo Room prediction of like an awful horrific event, finding out more information about this child's heart condition, possibly a grim ending for him too. But until we get to those parts, the storytelling feels quippy, breezy, a little bit almost like a camp level depiction of office work-life balance. And because there are so many people coming in and out of our main character's office, and they have different bags and motivations, and they're all kind of jockeying for different positions, it's also kind of toying with the possibility that we're about to have like a work shooting, which could explain the injuries we've seen on some of the characters, which in and of itself is terrifying. Like office place shootings, school shootings here in the US have become like such a staple of things that we see on the news that are like deep tragedies that we can't prevent or just won't prevent for whatever reasons. It has this grounded, terrifying element that someone might have insider knowledge that's going to happen even if it's through a premonition. They're unable to stop it, and first they saw the results, now they have to somehow live through it, and worse than all of that, her son is in the office with her. Spoilers, that's not what happens, but that just means that like this action piece we get that's different than expectations gets to be gritty, gruesome, and sort of a surprise to the reader, which gives it its own like sort of intense adrenaline horror rush all its own. And as we're coming down from the aftermath of this accident, that's when we roll roll into the second part of the horror surrounding her son and the potentiality of the heart condition. And it's this second half of the story that I think struggles to execute. This is a common issue I find with Stephen Graham Jones, that he's like doing too much at once. He's over-promising and kind of under-delivering, or delivering in a way that's less than 100% satisfaction. To be really fair to him, it's a very ambitious work. I think he does well on the first half, the Indigo room prediction results part. And I think where he leaves us with the sun and the heart condition is fine. Since for me, part of the horror is like the unpredictability, the shocking punch of it, there were very few ways he could go with this that would deliver on that expectation and really create a scare. And I think too, he didn't really have enough time to like make this child a full character, which leaves him a little bit of a prop for the mom. So I don't care about like a vulnerable child, because I don't read this kid as an individual on the storytelling present. And additionally, like his circumstances with a heart condition are tragic and sad, but I don't know that they are scary in that feel the fear kind of way. It's more like empathetically, this sucks for this mother, which I guess already has me rolling in a bit to the feel the fear sort of mantra. Even though that part of the story doesn't work, I think the other part about the accident in the office place, the uncertainty of it all, the way that something else is going on in the office at the same time, and had me distracted enough I almost forgot about this payoff, all works to make this sort of come out of nowhere, be an alarming moment, and make this woman wonder like what the heck was going on in the Indigo room that I sort of like pre-saw this thing. You know, it made me wonder if we were doing like an R.L. Stine Say Cheese and Die about like the haunted camera you take pictures with, and then the camera creates gruesome fates for anyone in the picture. Is that what's going on with the Indigo room? The lights go off, she sees this thing, and she made this come to fruition by seeing it? Or is this like a premonition of what's to come? And did her seeing it change the outcome in some way, shape, or form? Because it feels like she was on high alert for this situation to come into play, and it does seem like she was able to improve the outcome for one of the people involved. And for a short story, I don't require explanations. The fact that it happened, the fact that we don't know how it happened or what it means or what will happen in the future is scary. In a longer story, this wouldn't hold the same sort of bubble, but it works for me in a short. So I do think it meets Feel the Fear, and I do think it executes at an adequate level, but it's not as good as the first installment. As far as like the curve of a story where you start really strong in the front, you sort of let it slip down to a murky middle point here, and then come up and end on a high note, I do think the placement here is good for the Indigo room, because it is still doing pretty well, especially in the front. The ending leaves a little bit to be desired in my personal opinion, but I think opinions might vary on that. The Blanks by Grady Hendrix. I'm gonna say it right here, right now. Grady Hendrix is an overrated author. And if you think for a second that I'm wrong, read this story and come back to me on it. He's not a bad author by any means. Like, he writes adequately. But I look at how many people have read his books and how highly rated there are, and I just wonder, like, but why? And so if you go in blind to this story like I did, you're reading like a normal story about a family going to a beach vacation that's basically an imaginary island off the coast of New York that's like their version of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, except New York. It's all pretty normal. There's an odd moment where one woman wants to get on the ferry and isn't allowed, which I was like, how is that legal? But I suppose she could have done something on the ferry that would have made it such that if they're a private business, they could refuse to take her. And then, out of the blue, there's just this supernatural creature in a very, like, grounded, mundane-ass story. I was so thrown by this, I actually stopped reading, thought I was gonna have to start from the beginning again, but before I did that, I read the book summary, which is when it all snapped into focus about what was going on. But I would say it's not a great introduction if you require the reader to read the summary to understand what the fuck is happening in your book. And I don't think if I had continued reading further, I'd have gotten there and like accepted it. So I was kind of not happy with this book from that very moment on. But on top of all of that, if you read the summary of the book, you basically know exactly what's going to happen and how it's going to happen, because what these creatures are and what the rules are leave very little wiggle room in the narrative. So it's not interesting from a sense of uncertainty or dread. And like hiding the reveal of these creatures when you haven't done so in the summary, which most people, to be fair, usually read before jumping into a book, kills any sort of tension or pacing or like concern you might have, because now you're just watching a pre-planned tragedy unfold, which Hendrix style really doesn't help matters much because it's overwrought and just chock full of emotion. And considering our point of view is from a female lead protagonist, it feels a little icky for her to be so emotive and self-defeating. Like, it's not that it's unrealistic, I just felt like it chafed a little bit that this is how we decide to characterize her. On top of that, everything is very repetitive because there's only one foregone conclusion, so we're just circling the drain on that conclusion until it happens, which again is not scary for me. There's a very brief moment where we explore a kind of interesting idea where we compare these supernatural creatures that are on the island to potentially going and camping in the woods where bears are. Like, a bear attack could come and maul everyone, and if that was the situation on a camping trip, you wouldn't be at fault. But counter argument there, if you're just camping in some random woods and there are bears there, sure, not at fault. But like, say you went to Alaska, to bear country, during bear season where the bears are like very competitive and jostling with each other for resources, and you brought your whole family to witness that for some unknown reason, and you got attacked and mauled by bears, most people would consider that like a tragedy, but an inevitable tragedy, because you cannot go into bear territory while they're like fighting for resources and competing before hibernation in the winter and expect okay outcomes for yourself. And also, to sort of like resurrect an old meme about being alone in the woods and choosing the man or the bear, the whole reason so many women end up choosing the bear is because the bear is supposed to be in the woods. The bear doesn't have the same kind of agency that a man does. The bear is not going to see you, follow you in secret back to your camp, and attack you in the night while you're asleep. Like, after you've seen the bear, if you guys retreat and go your separate ways, you're probably in the clear with the bear. So to that end, the supernatural creature of the blanks are a lot less like the bear and a lot more like the man. Because you see a blank and it doesn't get you right then and there. It follows you. It stalks you, and eventually it gets its revenge on you for breaking the rules. So dying at the hand of these blanks is a lot less like a freak bear attack mauling someone in a camping accident, and a lot more like someone going to a city with a very high murder ratio for vacation. And then like telling yourself not to worry about the high murder ratio because the murderers usually pick citizens of the town, not vacationers. The murderers only come out at night, and as long as you don't look at the murderers for too long, they won't choose you. Which kind of means that the entire tragedy only happens because there's a bunch of very dumb people doing very dumb things. And like, I personally don't find that scary. A lot of times when that's the setup, like in a slasher film or whatever, I'm cheering for the bad guys. I do think that some people probably will find this scary. Certainly we are putting a child in danger, which always pulls at people's heartstrings because they're kind of like a vulnerable population that doesn't really know better and didn't have a lot of agency to put themselves in this situation. However, this is another situation where the child is not given that much screen time, so again, they feel kind of like a prop for the mom to like mourn over. There are a couple of scenes that I felt were really intense, which is something I look for in my horror stories. Unfortunately, we're getting that level of intensity from the father and not from our main protagonist. I personally would have skipped this one if it had been up to me in curating the collection, but if I had to include it, putting it here in the middle makes the most sense. It is technically a horror story. Technically, I can see where people would be scared, but I just don't align with those views. Moving us into A Night and Day in Misery by Catriona Ward. This story was too long, and given that it's only 34 pages in length, I have to assume it's a pacing problem. That said, the story otherwise nails it. The setting, the choice of protagonist, the journey they're going on. It's all very well chosen and atmospheric, and I think the story is revealing something a little bit deeper than just like a straight horror scary story does. I think there's like some underlying messaging and thematic resonance there that you could chew on afterwards. We're following a protagonist who lost her husband and young child a decade prior and still hasn't been able to get over it, so she is returning to the site where they died to sort of take her own life and join them in the the afterlife. I find it interesting this is the third book in the Shivers collection that uses a child or a mother-child relationship to sort of build fear and tension, and for me it's the first one that actually manages to execute on that. It does have a lot going for it in a shorter format because the child that we're discussing is a toddler, and while toddlers are definitely their own unique people with personality traits and all that kind of stuff, I expect them to express that in a slightly similar fashion. So you can get the humanity of a toddler across by saying things like he likes baths, or that he giggles a lot, or that he loved to visit his aunt. All of these like little touchstones are what you expect as far as like characterization from a toddler goes. And in fact, I think you get more characterization of that toddler based off of how adults interact with the toddler than the toddler themselves, centering it on the protagonist and bringing it back to how she interacted with the toddler doesn't end up making it feel like a prop for her to emote on. And this might just be my year for picking stories dealing with the aftermath of death and the extreme horror you can find after that person has died. Like, a lot of times you read horror, thriller sort of stories where what's at risk is your life or the life of your loved ones, and you have to play it just right to save them. But there's a whole separate kind of depression, sorrow, and horror in losing someone and having to go on without them. And I do think that like pairs really well with the horror of depression, the horror of self-harm, which FYI, if you're struggling with those things, this book might not be it for you because it's kind of really a rough read when it comes to like the rawness of our protagonist's emotions and where she is as far as emotional fragility goes. On a lighter note, Night and Day in Misery references both the actual town Misery where her husband and son spent their last night together, as well as the emotional state this woman is in. And while I was critical of that in Stockholm, I really like it here. With horror, I really am looking for like something to set tone and be more thematic and symbolic. And in this case, a word like misery really sells it for me, where Stockholm felt more like quippy, campy, haha side note to readers instead of like an atmospheric, symbolic structure. As far as where this book is placed in the collection, because it's building back up, I like it going right after the murky middle, sort of bringing us back up the parabola. I suppose you could flip this one in the Indigo room because the Indigo room's pacing is slightly better. However, the ending here in A Night and Day in Misery is significantly better than the Indigo room's. So I'd really say it's sort of like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other about whether or not this one goes better in 4th place or 2nd place. I'm leaning for it to be a little bit better in 4th place because, like, let's say you start in the high of Jackknife and then you're still high here in the Indigo room. It sort of slumps down at the ending. We're here at the bottom here with the blanks. The beginning starts strong here, but its ending is where it really like kicks it up and leaves you on this sort of like sharp, painful kind of shard of hope in the light of all of this darkness that's been revealed. A Night and Day in Misery is intense. And I'd say like the ghost element feels very classically gothic, reminiscent of like Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak or like Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, in that the ghosts are scary and they're there for a purpose to deliver a message to the specific person who's seeing them. And they're asking for something like really difficult from that human. That like demand to change or transform as a result of this ghostly visit is as painful in some ways as it is hopeful. As far as feel the fear, I'd say this totally qualifies. When you set up a mundane world and then just put ghosts in there suddenly, I think almost always that's a win. Because both the ghosts and the audience have no context for these ghosts' appearance, what they want, what they can and can't do, and just like not knowing the rules, not knowing why they're there, that level of uncertainty and the potentiality for like unknown levels of harm and a complete inability to protect yourself is really like motivating and intriguing, like for both reader and for whoever's experiencing it in story. And I think it's one of the only kinds of supernatural horror that you can create where you can have an uplifting, positive ending and it can still be a horror. Because whether this experience ends like Sixth Sense does, or it ends like The Bell Witch, there's all this uncertainty, terror, and dread in the middle while you're trying to figure out what these ghosts want and whether or not you can make them go away, or if you even need to do that. And last is going to be Letter Slot by Owen King. This was amazing. First, it's a huge perspective change from the parent-child dynamic that we've been experiencing to like the child being the focal point and them worrying about their parent. And I liked that immediate kind of like turnaround, sort of change of perspective here at the end. We follow 15-year-old Blake, who's watching his mother suffer from a long-term disability and something undiagnosed, and he's like really terrified, as well as the general poverty that this disability sort of thrust both of them into, and like all of her desperate hard work and struggling she's doing to try and keep the family afloat. And all of this has left him really like concerned about his own place in the world, what will happen to her, what will happen to him if something happens to her. So he writes a anonymous letter to a nobody that he's calling Buddy, where he just relieves all of this concern and trauma and sort of like lets it go into the ether. And with this letter in hand, on his walk home, he stops at like a abandoned model home because he's still sort of like full of all this emotional angst or whatever, and is sort of trying to blow it off before he gets to his mother. And being in the home does actually sort of make him feel more lighthearted, and he decides to just like stuff this letter in the letterbox there very thoughtlessly to get rid of it because it's sort of anonymous and he's done worrying about it for now. And then he goes home. Unfortunately, when he gets to his home, his mother has had a major medical incident. He has to get 911 on the phone. Because of this medical incident, he is going to end up going in foster care. There's going to be a million bills she can't pay for. She might even get fired from her jobs over it. It's just very stressful, bad news bears. And while he's like at this peak of critical uncertainty, he kind of races home to avoid the social care worker and finds a return letter for the one that he stuffed in the letterbox. And this mysterious force offers him and his mother a way out of all this trouble if he just gives up the name of one person he hates. As everything is at its peak right now, even though Blake has some misgivings about it, he's not even really certain he hates anyone, he writes down the name of a hateful bigot that's always picketing outside his high school and drops it off in the letterbox, hoping, I don't know, to improve his situation, but not to necessarily hurt anyone to have to do it. But also, I guess, prepared for that loss if that's how things play out, which is when this hateful bigot ends up attempting to kill his wife, and they find out through hospitalizing him he's got a brain tumor in there. So actually, we might say that no one was permanently hurt, and Blake targeting this guy actually got him medical attention he needed that he might not have gotten in time otherwise. And on top of all that, Blake's mother is making a quick recovery in the hospital. Instead of the job firing her, they're actually rewarding her for good work and giving her promotion. Blake and his mother get to move to a nicer place and everything is looking up. So we might say all's well that ends well here. Except the story doesn't end at this point. Because from this one event, there's all of these lingering questions and doubts and a continual pushing of the line. You know, one thing I personally had to wonder almost immediately is, did the mysterious letter person actually make Blake's mother's ulcer rupture at this juncture to put Blake in such a vulnerable and desperate state as to take him up on his deal? Because the first letter he pushed in the slot explains that he's afraid that there's something wrong with his mother's stomach and that she'll die from it. And the scans of the ruptured ulcer look exactly the same as the brain scans with the tumor from the bigot, which we could read as this malevolent force just passing the ulcer down directly into the brain tumor, or we could read it as like a signature thing that he can do to cause damage, where he starts with the mother to put Blake in the vulnerable situation and then transfers it to the bigot so that he can give him some good luck. Obviously, there's also a question about deserving and who gets to decide what someone does or doesn't deserve. It's hard to feel very bad for the bigot and his brain tumor, considering he's been like out there picketing gay students for a long time. He's obviously mentally unwell in some way. Brain tumor might be the cause of that. Or maybe removing the brain tumor will help him in some way, shape, or form. And even if none of that is the case, it's kind of like, I don't know that I care about him that much. Well, the scenario that Blake and his mother are in is like deeply unfair, and I think we should have more safety nets in place so what she's suffering isn't something that people find themselves in a position to be suffering. You know, it ends up making you ask yourself, what are you willing to give or to take from someone else to create security for another. And certainly this is like a supernatural switcheroo that never happened in the real world, but it is interesting to note where your own emotional level is at for this question. And it's also very interesting to note Blake's emotional development throughout this tale as well, because before he offers this name up, Blake is a very sensitive, very empathetic kid. He seems to be feeling way too much about his circumstances, everyone around him, but he's also kind of like an open book, like sharing with his mother, sharing with his best friend. And as he continually gets lured into using the power of luck through this letterbox, surrendering somebody else for misfortune, he seems to like become more collected, more cold, more reserved, more selfish. His sense of humor and laughter like literally dies, where you think he was struggling with his relationships a little bit before school because he was in such a desperate state he really couldn't dedicate time and energy to friendships. When he's in a more stable state, you think that he'd like reconnect with those friends, make closer ties, be more of the kid that he couldn't be before. But actually he becomes even more closed off and more separated from them, not thinking that like the jokes his friend makes are funny anymore, and like finding the fact that she's always joking annoying. It seems like a very strange mental shift, and we're unsure if this is a result of the kinds of choices he's been forced to make, or if this is like another aspect of the malevolent entity taking something from him. And also there seems to be a very core misunderstanding between Blake and his mother, and like what his mother's fears and hopes and dreams and wants are, and what it would take to make his mother happy versus like what Blake perceives would make his mother happy. And it's a thing he realizes a bit late in the story and makes him view what has happened up until now in a completely different light, and drives him to make a very impulsive teen choice that reminds us this is still a child who's making these decisions and doing these terrible things. How he responds is devastating, I think, for him and for his mother down the road as well. All of which sort of leads me to saying that it is one hell of a closer. I think as far as emotionally where I felt at the end of this story, it's a 5-star, and as far as like execution wise, it's a 4-star, because there's some interesting resonance in the location of this house, what this house has meant to his family, how he discovers that, and how he suddenly learns about all these similarities he has to a father that died when he was 2, and how he hates and rejects that and tries to like make amends only too late. And that echo there is really great. That connection this house and that letterbox has to his father, and I guess to his family as a whole, makes us wonder about the malevolent spirit that's there, that's kind of like making all this stuff happen, and like makes us wonder, is this his dad? Is this some kind of form of his dad, or like some kind of generational curse? If you're looking at it from like the plotting angle and what this means like in a world building kind of way, it actually kind of sucks and muddies the water. So I do think like your overall enjoyment of this story, especially that ending, is gonna vary whether you're a character-driven person or you're a plot-driven person. And as someone who's all in on the character, I liked the resonance, I liked the echoing repetition of what the father has done also being something that the son has done. Maybe even the idea that like part of his DNA and personality is just imprinted nature versus nurture, and this was always destined to be a misunderstanding, that he was always destined to sort of go this way, which is tragic and awful, but it's also terrifying that so much of who you are might be entirely out of your control. It might be a perfect reflection of your parents, even if your parents weren't in your life. Like, how awful. As far as the tagline, Feel the Fear, it tackles both mundane insecurities about survival, day-to-day getting by, as well as like supernatural forces and larger ethical questions. So I think it really hits you on all fronts and keeps driving in a way that doesn't give you too much time to stop and reflect. So wrapping it all up, I found the Shivers collection to be a really engaging installment in these Amazon original stories. It's not like a standout shining beacon with the best of the best, but I am surprised by how solid all of these stories are. Even the Grady Hendrix one, The Blanks, that I didn't much care for, if you told me you liked it, I kind of understand why, even if it wasn't for me. And for a horror collection where I would consider this genre more experimental and significantly more hit and miss, I think the overall roundup here is pretty impressive. If you were looking to add a couple more thrills and chills in your scary season, I think the Shivers collection could definitely be a fun inclusion. Talk to me in those comments down below. Recommend a couple other short novellas I could take on board for scary season, or all year round, I love a good horror short. And let's make the secret emoji be a jack-o'-lantern. As always, keep reading.